And we are in Vienna currently. I welcome our next guest speaker there, Mr. Ruediger Wischenbart.
Hello, this is Ruediger Wischenbart speaking. I'm very happy to be with you here in this recording for a book conference in Mariboru. And I'm supposed to talk about how the COVID-19 crisis is impacting the book business and the way we look at producing and disseminating books. I will choose a fairly international angle and talk about some fundamentals, some very generic observations, because I guess we must to get these primary things clear before we can properly and reasonably go into details and discuss how to apply this to our day-to-day publishing routines. I prepared a few slides, so allow me to switch my screen and have the presentation ready for you. Here we go. I call this books in times of disorientation, and when we speak about disorientation, the most appropriate way is to take a look on the map of the world as it is, but with regard to, for instance, the status of infections across many countries. That slide is a few weeks old, but it shows already how fragmented suddenly a globalized world has become, with countries shielding off against other countries. In the meantime, we have that situation even more complex within Europe, where countries within the European Union shield off each other because in the neighboring country or even in the neighboring province, the number of new infections has risen, and that is cutting on any way how we exchange, how we travel. We try to maintain the logistics of disseminating goods, but obviously when people start to interact, when people have more and more limitations to interact, the logistics of goods such as books is very quickly hit as well. Now, the most brutal way of showing that limitation occurred in spring in almost all countries across Europe, with the exception of Sweden, when countries had an imposed lockdown. So for 6-7 weeks or even 2 months, people were forced to stay at home if they had not really urgent, important business to do. From a reading and book person perspective, one would be a little bit intrigued that this might spell paradise, because suddenly people stay at home and have so much more time for reading. But in a wonderful conversation of book people, really good professional book people on Facebook, I discovered a thread where one, I guess she was a bookseller, said, strange question to all the community. I'm on holiday at the moment and usually spend every minute by a pool with a book in my hand. That was during the lockdown. But I'm really struggling right now and throughout this crisis. Anyone else had a similar experience? And instantly, within 24 hours, I don't know how many people, all book people, stepped in and said, yes, I read much less than normal, etc. So suddenly it showed that time alone was not enough as a factor. In the longer run, in many countries, however, we observed indeed a rise in reading. But that reading was soon to be different from normal reading in normal times, because people would buy books, educational books, or young adult reading for their kids who stayed at home and were not at school. So there were lots of opportunities in some niches while other parts of the book industry, like educational, were really nosediving and going down because people had very little time and very little reason to spend books on these other categories. So suddenly things started to change. Another factor was people had to work from home office. Now, the first thing was for many companies, it was a big struggle how to set up all the logistics to make that work. People working from home, and just imagine really big organizations like the international conglomerate book groups like Penguin Random House or Hachette or Simon & Schuster, with thousands of employees, turning such an engine of people and corporations and teams into a distributed network was very hard. But that turned out to be more easy to fix than anyone would have thought just a few months earlier. But now came the interesting point where people said, wait a moment, what can we learn from that home working experience? Is it more effective because people do not spend hours and hours in commuting from their homes to the office and back? Or is it less effective because people were so much more distracted? They went to the dishwasher, they had to take care of the children, they were doing the laundry, they had other things to do, they felt a little bit uneasy because everything was insecure. And it turned out that even in the most digital organizations, the assessment that came out of this was very contradictory. I found two very clear but totally opposed statements in The Economist. Jack Dorsey, who is the head of Twitter, says the company staff can work from home forever in the future. His colleague Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix, says home working is a pure negative. With many conversations with top management across the book industry, I had the same experience. You had some, like the people at Kobo, the ebook company, who said it made very little difference to them because they were a very distributed organization for many years. Others, like again in the case of Penguin Random House, had a totally different approach. They felt that suddenly they had to really change the organization and undergo a digital transformation, which was much harder than anyone would have guessed. And again, the very big organizations like Hachette, Penguin Random House, Simon & Schuster, they had an advantage of being in a digital transformation process already before for quite a few years. And they had big teams doing nothing but transforming the organization. But the mid-sized publishing companies, those houses who are doing most of the literature, the highbrow nonfiction, the quality books, the middle-sized organizations of 20, 50, 100, 200 organizations, they very often had hardly any experience with digitizing the entire workflow. So suddenly, it was really a moment of shock because many processes, companies, routines, supply chains had to become digital at once. And that is not stopping. That is just the beginning. We are not at the end of that journey. So there was a quick joke coming up on the internet saying, who is leading, in fact, at your company, that digital transformation? Is it the CEO? Is it the chief technology officer? Or is it flatly the virus, COVID-19, the sickness? So at the end, I tried to make sense of these challenges in a very simple way by defining 4 positions. Number 1, COVID-19 is not anything in particular with regard to you, just you in the book business. It is very specific perhaps for health, for sanitary services, for the political, economical and emotional strains it produces, but it's not specific to the book industry. But nevertheless, at the same time, it is very much a primary condition that is impacting how we live and interact, whatever we do. And that has very severe repercussions. A publisher from Mexico in Latin America, a small publisher, told me the future seems to be good because at his company, they had a good way of becoming digital, becoming more agile. But he was also clear to add, it is good for those who survive, because not everyone will survive it. It's really a threatening challenge for many companies. The third point is, it is not, COVID-19 is not a unifying force hitting everyone and everything equally. Just think, someone in an affluent Western European society is much more at ease, even if we feel the strains very hard. But compare that to someone living in South Africa, yeah? Or to someone in Mexico, in a smaller city. Yeah? It hits the old differently from the young. Big countries are in a totally different position as compared to small countries. The Swedish experiment of doing things in COVID differently is hardly imaginable in a big country like Germany or the US or China. But at the same time, everywhere, COVID-19 is right now accelerating these transformations that we had already before very strongly. And the bottom line is pushing hybrid, meaning digital and physical, and community-driven innovation is the key, also, not exclusively, but also in publishing and book selling. Now, over the past half year, in many countries, big or small, we had, with regard to the book trade, a curve that resembles the one that I show you here. It started to be a fairly good year, 2020. Then the COVID crisis and lockdown, etc., hit in March, April, May. So sales went really down dramatically, and then they recovered. But that is the point where the differences between countries have started to appear already. In the US, it was recovering quickly, and right now is above the same level of sales by comparison to last year, 2019. But in all countries, in all markets, we also see two phenomena that are making a difference, not by country or market, but by segment, between physical retail and everything digital, and between different genre categories. If you compare the US to the German market, as a second example, we see the German market is still, in July, minus 6.8% lower in terms of overall sales than what occurred in the first 7 months in 2019. But the basic pattern of first falling down and then coming back up is similar to the US. And the other thing that is similar, the stationary retail, the physical bookshops, were much harder hit, minus 12%, than the total market at minus 6.8%, because everything went to digital, to online book selling, and the small and medium-sized bookshops, in very many cases, could not compensate that shift quickly enough. So that is a big push in the direction of, for those who innovate quickly, it's good times because things are speeding up, but not everyone can cope with this successfully. Now, the world of hybrid publishing, where we have both physical and print things coming together, and they are not so opposed anymore, it's not really reasonable to cut the world into the physical versus the digital, but these things interact. I can have a digital community of people who are buying printed books. But this is not a very bland, digital, distanced, not lively world. All the different, the opposite is true. It's a very colorful, but also a very complex world. Just a few examples. We did with a German digital distributor, Bookwire, with their real sales data for the first half year of 2020, a number of analyses showing how the lockdown, before the lockdown, during the lockdown, and after the lockdown, impacted digital sales. And digital means not only ebooks, it means ebooks, and it means audiobooks, and it means sales. So you download and you buy and download a book, and it means also subscription services, ongoing sales. Overall, in ebooks, we saw a really continuous growth. So ebooks, which have been blamed over the past few years as being something not really successful, had a comeback, and we expect that to be quite lasting. But also, when we looked into audiobooks and compared sales, I buy and download an audiobook versus I subscribe to a streaming service, to have a totally different performance in that the sales, the red curve, the red curve had a big peak at the beginning when all the parents bought a lot of children audiobooks to their kids. Then they had their stock, and then the sales flattened out. But still, after the crisis, it was stronger than before the crisis. Meanwhile, subscription services, which are a fairly new phenomenon in books and reading, they had a continuous rise. So we see a first very strong indicator that very fundamental user practices, user habits, consumer habits are starting to shift. Then we also have the observation that what happens exactly, if you go really into the detail, is very different between one category of genres or another, between education, fantasy, fiction, children, young adult, etc., etc., etc. And we see in the past, for instance, ebooks had been mostly about just a few genres: bestseller fiction, thrillers, fantasy, and romance. That seems also to change. Again, consumer habits seem to transform in that in one genre category it's different from the other. Fiction is growing more continuously, other fantasy the same. Other categories like education were having a good time but then falling off because people still find themselves to be uneasy with digital education. But still, after the crisis of the lockdown, the basic level is significantly higher than before. So that's what I mean by being colorful and more complex. You have a book, in that case, a crime series like Stieg Larsson 10 years ago, that was a kind of an innovating example of a series of books transforming and suddenly becoming not only popular in many different countries, first in Sweden, then in Germany, then the tipping point was France, and then it went big in the US. But it also very soon became all sorts of other things connecting to consumers. It was turned into movies, of course. It was used for promotional things. You could sell candy with Stieg Larsson. You saw it as a comics and a cartoon, etc., etc. And that impacted back to the publishing side. And that means that those who have the rights, the authors, the agents, and sometimes the publishers, have to manage a much more complicated, complex environment. To sum it up, COVID-19, as I said, is a very primary condition which is impacting how we live and interact overall, and very deeply and very strongly, because it is accelerating transformations that were driving change already before. What we should not do is expect a return to normal, with normal meaning pre-COVID. That is not going to happen. Things transform, and there are many opportunities for those who handle them, who pick them up, who experiment, who learn how to work with the end consumer, who learn how to organize digital communities, who diversify, who learn to analyze data, take controlled risks, and look twice. And those who also have the stamina, the appetite to collaborate with others. And I guess that taking controlled risks, experiment and collaborate is the key to the post-COVID, post-pandemic future. I thank you for your attention. I invite you very strongly to come to a few websites, like my personal website, wischenbart.com, and the Reboot. This is a new venture that we have, rebootbooks.org, which is specifically about the pandemic impact on publishing. And you find many reports that you might find interesting. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for interesting lecture, and kind regards to Vienna. Thank you.